All right.
Second to let her know town of Walk Hills. Let her know that Mr. Lake is here.
Okay. Good evening, everybody. I'm just going to give a couple more minutes for those who haven't signed on quite yet. To be respectful of everybody's time, I'm just going to get started. My name is Carrie Christensen. I work with the Orange County Planning Department, and I support the Orange County Municipal Planning Federation. On behalf of both organizations, I thank you for joining us this evening. Just a few housekeeping items. If everybody can just make sure that their name is in, just so I can make sure everyone gets credit. I do know that the Town of Walk Hill Planning Board, there's multiple people in the room. I'll reach out to the secretary tomorrow just to make sure I know everybody who was there. And another thing, I will make sure that all of my contact information is in the chat in case anyone has questions afterwards or anyone needs certificates so they can get their credits. I can definitely assist you with that. And without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Kate Schmidt, who can kick off our evening.
of the evening. I'm having a problem getting this.
We can hear you now, Kate.
Thank you. Yes, because you hear me talking to myself. I'm trying to show you, but when I do that, let's see if that works. And now we want to start from the beginning, right? Okay, good. Everyone can see my name? Yes, fantastic. Thank you. And likewise, if you need to get in touch with me, this is my information there. I am the Sustainability Coordinator Land Use Planner, and I thank you all for joining us on this fantastically lovely evening. I thought it was going to rain, so this is a joy. We remind everyone to please mute yourself. So we will take questions at the end. And if you have any inquiries that you need to have answered in order to understand to go on, or any conversation or anything you want to put out and share, links, email addresses, anything, please use the chat function. It's there for a reason, and it's a great exchange of information and thought. Please remember that the session is being recorded, and the recording along with the slides will be available on our Orange County website, and that is orangecountygov.com/sustainability. Easy to remember. And all of our the past month of meetings are there as well. And well, with that out of the way, welcome to the second annual March Madness Month of Meetings Sustainability Edition. And thank you to the Federation tonight for partnering with us. The Federation and County Planning offer many trainings throughout the year with the intent to inform and educate the public and hopefully inspire folks to take action and volunteer in their community. Inspire what, you may ask? Well, one example is state programs such as Climate Smart Communities, CSC, and Clean Energy Communities, CEC. They incentivize municipalities to go sustainable by awarding points that lead to certified designations that can include higher levels such as bronze, silver, and gold. And there are hundreds of actions that can be taken in the Climate Smart community and about 13 in the CEC. And tonight we have New York State Energy Research Development Authority, commonly known as NYSERDA. We have their Clean Energy Community Coordinator, Kat Carroll from the Hudson Valley Regional Council here to explain more about that. And Ms. Carroll provides technical assistance and outreach to municipalities interested in cost savings and environmental benefits throughout the Hudson Valley. She has a little help from some other folks in her office, but she's the person you go to if you have any questions, and she'll explain that more later. For now, I just want to start with a little intro and a history of solar in Orange County. Years ago, it became very apparent that Orange County was the sweet spot for solar energy development, largely due to our proximity to the enormous electricity demand from New York City. Orange County municipalities were inundated with solar proposals, and as a result, many municipalities enacted moratoria on solar facilities until they could properly plan for the onslaught. And over a third of our municipalities have developed updated solar zoning in their code. However, the solar facilities, and we do call them facilities, we discourage the use of the term solar farms because we are an agricultural community. But the solar facilities kept growing in size and efficiency and technology. And the addition now of battery storage has resulted in the need of further zoning and coding amendments. Now, if you missed, we did that. I think, Carrie, we said on January 13th, we offered that class through NYSERDA. And if you missed that, we're going to make sure that gets up on our website at orangecountygov.com/sustainability. But we need about a week to make sure we get IT to get that up. So our office reminds all municipalities that the logical location for any solar facility are on brownfields and already developed sites first, such as rooftops and parking lot canopies. Green fields and certainly forested areas should be only used as a last resort. That's not what we're seeing though, is it? On March 21st this month, we offered a training on the very, very valuable toolkit for municipalities developed by Scenic Hudson. And it guides municipalities to properly plan for solar and identifies the best locations for these facilities. And like I said, that presentation and the recording are on our website. Since renewable energy technology keeps evolving though, our goal is to support municipalities by helping them to protect, they have to prepare to protect their municipality and the constituents, the taxpayer. Another helpful resource is to host an internal entity to examine this new technology. And they could research how it will impact their municipality, the benefits, the cons, the costs, short and long term. And such a special committee usually requires volunteers to accomplish these actions. This committee could be a Conservation Advisory Commission, also known as a CAC, or a Conservation Board, or an ERB, which is an Environmental Review Board, or an Environmental Management Commission or Council, EMC. These are terms maybe you've heard. Orange County has had about 12 throughout the years. That's what you're looking at right now. So I lost my train of thought. I apologize. So Blooming Grove CAC was created because of the enormous flooding impact of Hurricanes Irene, Rita, and Lee, I believe. A committee was formed to study the effects of the flooding and how to shore up their community in the face of the future flooding. And then they morphed into an official CAC. And the reason why I'm bringing this all up, you'll understand soon, because this municipal board reviews development proposals concurrently with a municipal planning board. But this same group of dedicated volunteers can champion other items as well, such as stream monitoring, wetland identification, water protection, other worthwhile efforts. And these CACs, Conservation Advisory Councils, frequently participate in New York State Trees for Tributaries program. They plant trees along important waterways. The Montgomery CAC was instrumental in saving a farm from development and instead created a thriving public park, Benedict Field on Albany Post Road. Some of you may have been there. Now, recently, these same conservation-minded groups are broadening their scope to take on these state sustainability challenges that we talked about. And that can include recycling, composting, energy and waste audits, LED lighting, energy efficient upgrades, municipal comprehensive plans, sustainability plans, energy plans, feasibility studies, vulnerability assessments, clean energy initiatives, electric vehicle charging stations, and just plain old community education. So constituents can save money and save the environment while we're there. This short list is just a few of the potential actions that can be awarded points. Some meaningful and impactful actions on my wish to include local laws that would require all new construction to include geothermal heating and cooling systems and photovoltaic or solar systems on roofs or commercial parking lots, disincentivizing lawns or gas-powered landscaping equipment, and rather incentivizing water saving, no chemical, no maintenance, bee, butterfly friendly pollinator gardens. I could go on, but I'll stop there. The aforementioned Montgomery CAC has hosted numerous educational forums and everything from solar to electric vehicles to heat pumps. Most recently with New York State DEC grants from the town of Montgomery, Cornwall, and Blooming Grove, they have all completed a natural resources inventory, or better known as an NRI. And they're working on their community preservation plans. In the case of Blooming Grove, they've already completed it 3 years ago already. The point is the creation of a CAC in your municipality will convene a group of interested folks, could be as little as 3 individuals, that can advance all of this good work and more, resulting in state recognition, grant preference, and even monies. We have had like I said, we had about a dozen. If you are interested in starting a CAC, please reach out to me. I can help you. If you're interested in a climate smart community in a CAC, you can reach out to me. You could also reach out to Kat Carroll. So let's kick it off. Kat Carroll joined Hudson Valley Regional Council in May last year. And as the NYSERDA Clean Energy Community Coordinator, she will promote clean energy and energy efficient measures for communities to municipalities interested in the cost savings and environmental benefits associated with the clean energy communities' high impact actions. She has previously worked in municipal planning with the Otsego, so many O's upstate, the Otsego County Conservation Association, and as a policy and analytics consultant with the commercial solar broker, SolarCal. And she completed her master's on environmental policy at Bard Center for Environmental Policy, concentrating on environmental consumption, economic inequality, and labor governance. And Ian Latimer is a senior project manager with the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority's Clean Energy Siting Team, where he works directly with communities, local governments, and industry stakeholders to pursue responsible siting and installation practices for clean energy technologies. Ian's responsibilities include developing clean energy resources and trainings for local governments, supporting NYSERDA programs regarding small and large-scale solar, energy storage, and wind, and more recently, helping lead NYSERDA's stakeholder engagement activities pertaining to green hydrogen, which is the most exciting for me. There it is, back to that always changing technology. So municipalities have to roll with it, and we want to help you roll with it. So as stated earlier, please use the chat box. And with that, Kat, please take it away.
All right, thank you. Let me share my screen quickly, and we will go ahead.
Great.
Okay. All right, so apologies, looks like I'm having some bandwidth issues. I'd like to thank Orange County for this opportunity to present a high-level overview of the Clean Energy Communities Program. My name is Kat Carroll, as Kate said, and I'm a Clean Energy Communities Coordinator with the Hudson Valley Regional Council. The Hudson Valley Regional Council is one of 9 regional councils in New York State and one of over 600 nationally. We provide technical support to municipalities across our various programmatic areas listed here. So please feel free to reach out to us on any of these areas. We pride ourselves in providing impartial, transparent, and informative technical support to local governments. The leadership round of the Clean Energy Communities Program offers flexible grant funding for clean energy projects with no local cost share and creates pathways to lower utility bills in homes, businesses, and municipal buildings through a variety of high-impact actions. Clean Energy Community Coordinators are available to provide technical support. We connect local governments with resources and toolkits designed to facilitate your pursuit of clean energy high-impact actions. We also connect municipalities with entities that can support a community's completion of those high impact actions. Since the launch of the initial round of the Clean Energy Communities Program in August 2016, over 700 local governments have participated in the program. The leadership round expands the number of opportunities through which the local governments can reduce their energy use from 10 actions to 24 actions. The leadership round also provides communities with more diverse pathways towards flexible, match-free grant awards available on a first-come, first-served basis. Local governments across the state have access to $17 million in grant awards. Each region has an allocation of $880,000 that's available only to a region's municipalities, and communities can also compete for the $8.18 million in grant awards on those actions that are available to all state communities. There are 3 separate types of match-free awards: designation, point-based grants, and action awards. The leadership round point-based grants rewards communities for completed actions through the accumulation of points. The more energy an action saves, the more points a community can earn, leading to larger grant amounts that may be available to a community. Point-based grants are available in separate buckets: by points, by community size, and by geography. In the Mid-Hudson region, our larger grants for small or medium communities are gone, but there are still 17 $10,000 grants available for reaching 3,000 points. Communities can also receive action grants by completing the New York Stretch Energy Code action and community campaigns actions. The grant award amounts and number of grants available, again, differ by community size. In these last few slides, I want to touch on the high impact actions that may be of interest to municipalities within Orange County. As noted, there are 24 actions and they are nested within 14 high impact action categories. Actions come with a variety of points. Those with a set number of points are single level actions, and others with ranges, like community campaigns, include sub-actions that each come with their respective point allocations. The Unified Solar Permit streamlines the permitting process for small-scale solar under 25 kilowatts. Energy Code enforcement training ensures that the state energy code is well enforced throughout a municipality. PACE financing, which only cities, counties, and towns in Westchester County are eligible to adopt, is a program that allows property owners to pay back the cost of clean energy upgrades to their commercial or nonprofit property, and is secured through a benefit assessment lien on the approved property. A municipality that has reduced greenhouse gas emissions from municipal facilities by 10% since August 2016 is eligible for the Clean Energy Upgrades Action. The Clean Heating and Cooling demo serves to demonstrate the utility and environmental benefits of installing heat pumps as the main heating and cooling mechanism for a government building. Conversion of 50% of a municipality's streetlights to LEDs can reduce electricity costs substantially and also qualifies for CEC credit. Benchmarking serves to create a snapshot of municipal building energy usage in order to identify which buildings are most in need of energy efficiency work. Clean Fleets involves the installation of electric vehicle chargers or the deployment of light or medium or heavy duty electric vehicles. The Climate Smart Communities certification process provides local governments with a robust framework to guide their climate action and celebrates the leadership of high-performing communities. Designed around the CSC pledge elements, the certification program awards points for actions that reduce greenhouse gas emissions and build community resilience to climate change. CCA, or Community Choice Aggregation, is a municipal energy procurement model that replaces the utility as the default supplier of electricity for virtually all homes and small businesses within the jurisdiction. CCA puts control of choosing energy supply in local hands. The county-hosted training's High Impact Action, which we're here for tonight, is designed to help communities understand how to manage responsible clean energy development in their communities. The New York Stretch Energy Code is a more efficient energy code that can earn small or medium communities a $5,000 action grant. And community campaigns serve to promote the usage of electric vehicles, community solar, demand response, or heat pumps. So that brief run through of all of the high impact actions, I hope has provided you with some ideas of the purpose of the CEC program. If you're interested in pursuing any of these high impact actions with your community, please reach out to me. I'll put my contact info in the chat in just a moment. I also wanted to give a brief overview of the Climate Smart Communities program. The CSC program is sponsored by 7 state agencies working to support municipalities to take action in the fight against climate change and is led by the Department of Environmental Conservation. It provides a pathway to reduce greenhouse gas pollution and build resiliency in the face of climate change. There are 12 pledge elements that make up the Climate Smart Communities program, including inventorying emissions and planning for climate action, decreasing energy usage, shifting to clean renewable energy, using climate smart materials management, climate smart land use, green innovation economies, enhancing community resilience, and then a number of actions that are related to informing and inspiring the public, engaging in an ever-evolving process of climate action, and additional points for innovation and performance in these areas. So this slide, which displays the CEC-CSC crosswalk, serves to visualize the connection between the CEC and the CSC programs. All of the actions that communities take under the CEC program can also earn Climate Smart Communities credit. And finally, with this, my short presentation on the CEC program and the Climate Smart Communities program has concluded. Thank you for your time, and I'd like to hand things over to Ian Latimer to get into the main topic for tonight.
Thank you, Kat. Really appreciate that. It's a good refresher for all of us. Let me go ahead and just get my screen pulled up. Give me just one moment here. All right, you should be able to just see my screen and not the speaker notes, right? How are we looking? Seeing the thumbs up from Kate.
It looks
Thanks,
good.
Kate. Perfect. All right, well, perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much, Kat, again, for getting this kicked off, and Kate and Carrie and everyone with the Municipal Planning Federation for bringing us together tonight. I think, some of you may recognize me from previous trainings, but again, my name is Ian Latimer, Senior Project Manager here on the Clean Energy Siting team at NYSERDA. I have the absolute privilege of working with communities all across the state, including in Orange County, on things related to solar storage, and as Kate said, starting on hydrogen as well. So if and when questions come up, please, happy to talk about any and all things. But tonight we are here for the model solar law. Now, this is one of the 5 courses that we're offering for the county hosted trainings, high impact action. But I do want to recognize that, as Kate said, Orange County municipalities very frequently are no strangers to solar. And so what I want to make sure that we're doing is, hitting all of the content that we need to be sharing for the presentation tonight, while also building in some of the Orange County specific concerns or topics that you're interested in hearing about. So, I've got material I have to get through, but I want to make sure that we're also making sure it's relevant to, the concerns and the trends and things that you're seeing in the county, and providing anything that I can do of service that goes beyond what's in the slides as part of the course here. So I'm happy to go through this tonight. I anticipate we'll leave a few minutes at the end for Q&A, where folks will be able to take themselves off mute and ask some questions. But please do make use of the chat as we go throughout tonight and ask any questions in there that you'd like to. Carrie, I'm not able to access the chat while I'm presenting. I think we spoke about this earlier, but if there's any questions that come in that you want to do throughout the webinar as opposed to saving them till the end, please feel free to hop in whenever it seems like a good time. If it's a particularly pertinent question, I'm happy to take them throughout. Otherwise, I look forward to questions at the end, and I really appreciate you guys being here tonight, giving me your Tuesday night for a good cause, and looking forward to getting into it here. So as far as the agenda for tonight, really just a couple of main sort of sections of the event. I'll start with an introduction to myself and the siting team at NYSERDA, as well as an overview of New York State's clean energy landscape, including some of the policies and programs affecting clean energy development in the state. From there, we'll go to the main portion of tonight's presentation, which is again focused on the model solar law, which is part of our solar guidebook for local governments, one of the resources that we have at the siting team here at NYSERDA. And then from there, again, I'll leave at least 10, 15 minutes if we can for Q&A based on how we're moving through the material tonight. And so again, feel free to make use of the chat. You've got my name, Ian Latimer, Senior Project Manager at NYSERDA. That's me. I'm on the siting team. Again, one of our primary responsibilities on the siting team is putting together and updating resources for local governments. So the primary resources that we offer are these clean energy guidebooks, which exist for solar, wind, and battery energy storage. The more recent resource that we put out last year is Clean Energy in Your Comprehensive Plan, which was addressed in a previous webinar as part of Kate's March Madness programming, which I presented. So I apologize if you've had to spend now 4 hours with me in the last month and change, but you'll forgive me for being the face that gets old. So that's the siting team. These are our resources, and we're always looking to update and grow these, our resource offerings. So if there's any topics that you feel are not addressed in our resources or places that you're looking for more information, please don't hesitate to reach out and tell us. You can go to our website. You can send me an email with my contact information here, which I'll throw in the chat, or will be available in the slides that are shared with you all. Feel free to reach out. I'm always happy to talk, always happy to expand, make sure that the resources that we have are relevant for the concerns being seen by local communities. And to that end, I want to note that we are currently updating the model law, which we are presenting on tonight, as well as the solar guidebook itself. So I'm going to do my best to call attention to some of those updates that we're making as we go throughout the content tonight. But I also recommend that you keep an eye out for an updated version of the model law and an updated version of the guidebook in the near future. And with that, let's get into solar. I know I don't have to spend much time here because, again, you guys are well acquainted with solar, but just a reminder that when we're talking about solar in this context, we're really talking about solar photovoltaics, or PV. We're not talking about concentrated solar power or solar thermal systems, which are a different type of utilizing solar energy to accomplish something. Sometimes that's electricity generation, sometimes it's heating, but really we're talking about conventional solar PV, which are solar panels. And when we talk about types of installations that you're going to be looking to regulate at the local level, it's everything from residential systems up through commercial and utility scale solar projects. Sometimes you'll hear words like behind the meter or front of the meter, which refers to the configuration of the project in terms of its relationship to the demand being served. What I mean by that is if the solar is paired, on top of a roof of a commercial or a residential building, that's going to be behind the meter because it's directly connected to the house. Behind the utility meter, it's not feeding directly into the grid, versus a front of the meter project, which is going to feed electricity directly into the grid infrastructure, and it's not tied to the user of that electricity. When we talk about ground-mounted solar generally, typically these solar projects occupy around 5 to 7 or 5 to 8 acres per megawatt. That can change depending on the type of installation. But generally speaking, that's sort of the proxy, because that amount of land per megawatt will allow for some flexibility in site design, meaning you can avoid the use of sensitive wetlands or environmental areas, while making sure you have enough land to space out the project and avoid any shading issues with vegetation or trees. And then typically you'll hear people refer to ground mounted solar as applying to, around 100 to 200 megawatts, or 100 to 200 homes per megawatt that can be powered by a megawatt of solar. I'll just say, generally speaking, I really try and move beyond the sort of one-to-one comparisons, just because as we look at an increasingly electrified future, we need to not really solely be thinking about, energy generation as directly tied to, residential or commercial uses, because we're all going to be looking to adopt electric vehicles and other forms of electrification that really change the profile of our grid. But generally, still a helpful metric just to sort of have as an idea. When it comes to land use impacts of clean energy, as with sort of any land use, there's certain considerations that are going to be applicable to all clean energy technologies, which include, congruence with your zoning regulations that you have on the books already, making sure compatible land uses are being taken into consideration, environmental impacts, alignment with your bulk and area standards in your zoning, decommissioning requirements, and taxation. Those are considerations that I think are pretty applicable across uses. Maybe not decommissioning, maybe that's a bit more energy specific, but still applies to all sorts of clean energy generating technologies. With solar in particular, I think visual and aesthetic impacts have really been a forefront issue when it comes to the alignment of community character with especially larger scale solar projects. And then agricultural land impacts have emerged as another key factor. And I just want to make sure that, in my opinion, I think in order to really address solar in zoning and come up with creative solutions, I think we really need to be clear that visual and aesthetic impacts and agricultural land impacts are not the same thing. And that, there are steps that you can take to, mitigating impacts on the visual and aesthetic impacts, as well as agricultural land impacts, but those are not always the same concern. And I think it's pretty important to be clear about, when you're trying to address a concern that, we're calling a spade and coming up with solutions that respond to those accordingly. So we'll talk about some of these concerns a bit later once we get into the model law, and I anticipate that that's probably where we'll want to spend some time and have some questions. The other thing to keep in mind is that other technologies present other concerns as well. So energy storage, those systems are not going to have the same type of visual and aesthetic impacts necessarily, unless you're getting a really large system. However, the main consideration in my perspective for energy storage is really the fire safety and incident management piece. That's really where you want to make sure that municipalities are well versed and are able to procure training for their first responders to make sure that we're able to adequately respond to a system if and when there's an incident. That's less of a concern with other generating technologies. So again, the primary considerations will sort of change depending on the technology. Now, Kate had mentioned that, as early as 2016, 2017, you were seeing a lot of interest in Orange County in solar, and the landscape in terms of New York's policy and programs has only changed since then. So I want to spend a couple minutes talking about where we stand currently. In 2019, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, also known as the CLCPA or the Climate Act, was adopted, which codified a few really important sector-wide and technology-specific goals for the state of New York. So sector-wide, it put us on a track to have to meet 70% renewable electricity by 2030, in turn to meet 100% emissions-free electric grid by 2040. Which means weaning ourselves off of emissions or emitting generation sources like natural gas plants, And then it also codified a few technology specific goals. Among those were originally 6,000 megawatts of distributed solar by 2025, which based on the state's progress to date has recently been upped to 10,000 megawatts of distributed solar by 2025. Now, as a reminder, when I say distributed solar, I mean everything from rooftop solar through 5 megawatt sized community solar projects. So everything in that sort of gulf is considered a distributed energy resources project. Anything above 5 megawatts is going to be a large scale renewables project and is not counted in that 10,000 megawatts goal. We also are looking to implement 9,000 megawatts of offshore wind by 2035 and 3,000 megawatts of energy storage by 2030 with an interim goal of 1,500 megawatts. Those capacity targets are also likely to be increased based on the amount of energy storage that's been deployed and is in the pipeline to date. So the good news is that we are doing great on meeting our targets and are even able to go beyond those ambitious targets. The less good news is that we still have a long ways to go in terms of real meaningful electrification in the state and getting to that 70% renewable by 2030. So a lot of good happening and a long ways to go as well. In terms of providing a snapshot of where we stand in terms of clean energy in New York State, the most recent production or generation numbers that I am able to get are from the New York Independent Systems Operator, which date back to 2020 for production. You can see in there that we were around 27 or 28% renewable as of 2020. Now, there's a few things to sort of unpack there. One of those things is that a lot of the large scale renewables which have been awarded in the last few years by NYSERDA are currently projects that are being permitted or are even under construction right now. So given the slowdowns that we've had in 2020 and 2021 due to COVID and supply chain issues, there's definitely been a delay in bringing large scale projects onto the grid, but we are seeing those projects in motion now. So we do anticipate seeing a nice change in that percentage of renewable generation moving forward. You can also see on the right here, as of December 31st, at the end of 2021, you can see the most recent figures that we have on distributed energy or solar deployment in the state of New York. You can see we're almost at around 3,500 megawatts of deployed solar as of, again, the end of the year last year. So in a really good position to meet our 10 gigawatts of solar by 2025 target, given how much is in the pipeline and the rate at which we're able to deploy. And you can see Orange County remains, one of the hot spots of the state in terms of solar deployed to date. I don't know that where it is in terms of, the amount in the pipeline relative to other parts of the state. I'd be happy to, pull those numbers. I don't know them off the top of my head, but you can also see, in Long Island and Westchester, out in Erie County, up in Monroe County and elsewhere in the state, we're seeing increased amount of renewables as well. So exciting stuff. In terms of the types of solar, again, I want to just sort of break it down even a little bit further. So for distributed solar, again, talking about everything from residential through commercial or community solar sized solar projects. You can sort of see this smattering of projects across the state. And I think it's really important to see maps like this and the one on the previous page, because it's really important that we remind ourselves that, the burden of clean energy and the burden of decarbonization does not rest on the shoulders of one community or even one county. And that the state is taking a very multifaceted approach, using everything from offshore wind to land-based renewables all across the state. Because it's a tremendous undertaking, and it requires everyone across the state to be involved. And so obviously, Orange County has the benefit. Maybe not everyone would characterize it as the benefit, but having been involved from an early point in the state's clean energy journey, and absolutely will continue across the state as we look to meet our ambitious targets. When it comes to distributed solar, incentives are provided through NYSERDA's New York Sun program, which you may have heard about a bit from Candace, my colleague, when she presented earlier this year. But New York Sun provides incentives to everyone from homeowners to community solar projects to make sure that we can grow our distributed solar market across the state. And so again, we've got a new target to hit of 10 gigawatts. And you can see we're pretty well on our way to meeting that target in the next few years. In addition to the distributed solar market, there's also large-scale renewable projects, which again, categorically include everything above 5 megawatts. So everything that's larger than a community solar project. Every year, NYSERDA issues a solicitation whereby they, invite developers to propose large-scale projects, and then they go through a competitive award process, at the end of which a certain amount of projects are selected to receive a contract incentive or an incentive contract from NYSERDA. We are still awaiting the announcement of the awards for the 2021 solicitation, but that will be the 4th or 5th year that we've done these solicitations, dating back to 2017. You can see the map of large-scale projects that have been awarded by NYSERDA through these solicitations on this map here. And again, you can see that it's really not one part of the state that's carrying, fully the burden for where these projects are going. It's really, it's all across the state. It's an all hands on deck approach, including the offshore wind you can see down at the bottom of the map. Projects awarded under the large-scale solicitations include solar, wind, repowering of old hydroelectric facilities, and then complementary battery energy storage facilities as well. And then finally, with NYSERDA programming, we have the siting team again, which I don't need to spend much time on, but we've got these guidebooks and availability to provide technical assistance, including legal and other assistance as well through our contractor network. You're more than welcome to fill out a technical assistance request form or reach out to our team directly if there's anything that we can do to be helping you. If you have an individual project or just general clean energy policy that you're looking to develop, we are able to help at no cost to you. Really would just love to help, promote balance in terms of, the clean energy deployment across the state. So that's really what we're trying to do. We're always happy to be a resource if and when we can be helpful. And with no further ado, the Solar Guidebook for Local Governments is really where we'll be spending our time tonight. So again, we're focused on the Model Solar Law chapter of the guidebook, which we are currently in the process of updating, but some other forthcoming updates that are around the corner. We're going to be really growing our chapter in the guidebook regarding solar installation on agricultural lands by replacing the current version, which just focuses on solar in ag districts, by really broadening that, talking a lot more about, solar and agriculture in terms of state policy and what is happening across the state, as well as what we're seeing in terms of strategies for making solar and agriculture more compatible uses for projects developed on agricultural lands. So highly recommend that you keep an eye out for that. I'm sure that we'll probably be doing some webinars around the rollout of that resource and bringing in some experts, but please do keep an eye on the space and we'll be happy to talk further about that. Just want to pause real quick. Carrie, are there any questions that we want to hit before we jump into the model law as of now?
The one question we do have in the chat is in regard to policies and plans for recycling the panels and or batteries when they've kind of hit their max use. I'm not sure if that's something you're going to be touching on within your presentation, or if you want to take a moment and answer that now.
Yeah, I can hit on that right now. And it's a really good question. And it's one that I frankly wish I had a better answer to. I know that there are some discussions, and there have been at least one county, to my knowledge, that I think has taken steps, if not adopted a resolution to require panel recycling. I'll say that battery recycling is an industry that's much more developed. In fact, New York has to my knowledge, the largest lithium-ion battery recycling facility in the US to date. That's located up in Rochester. It's a company called Li-Cycle. In terms of regulations, I don't know that the state has taken action. It would definitely be a state legislature move. It wouldn't be something through NYSERDA if I had to guess. I don't know if that's gained any traction, but I definitely think that it's something that we want to encourage. The challenge becomes that, lithium-ion batteries are a lot more prevalent. Therefore, it's a lot more feasible to require recycling of lithium-ion batteries, because there's enough of a product to do that. If you were to require solar panels to be recycled in terms of, as a consideration for deployment, we are, probably a decade or two away from there being enough solar panels that are no longer generating to have like a reasonable recycling stream to expect someone to crop up. To my knowledge, the only recycler of solar panels in the US is First Solar, who is a manufacturer that does a type of panels known as thin film cadmium telluride panels, which we do not have in New York. It's not a technology that's used in the state of New York. And so to my knowledge, there's not really much of a recycling infrastructure for solar panels. I highly expect that to change in the next few years, if not a decade, as the industry grows and the amount of panels that need recycling increases. But as of now, I'm not sure if there's been any movement on a policy at the state level.
Ian, So
Yes,
one
ma'am.
of the questions that came up last night at the first responders training was what happens with the batteries after they are damaged from water or gas when they're extinguished. And so the concern was that could start to add up. Where do they go? Can they be recycled? Is the state looking into this? I don't have my notes here at home from last night, but I guess what I looked at it was these emergency responders who are on the front lines are interacting and seeing what happens. It's not in a perfect controlled environment like many testing products are. And they're seeing something different than maybe the state was reporting last night. We had someone who was challenging Jennifer, our speaker from NYSERDA. And I just wonder, how does that all play out in the next few years? Where's the following of that real life information, tracking it and making sure it gets recycled?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Again, I'm not really sure that I have a great answer for it. Again, to my knowledge, the only lithium ion battery recycling facility is up in Rochester. I know that there was another one proposed in Endicott, but I believe that project was stalled, and so we have the one facility up there. My understanding would be twofold. Number one, that what you do with a product that's been, that's no longer in service. Sorry, I just moved that. That's no longer in service or has been damaged. I mean, the first thing is that it's going to depend on the manufacturer's, warranty the warranty and or the material handling recommendations that are part of it, because they know their product better than anyone. I would imagine that many of them can be recycled, and I don't know the extent to which you can mandate that in terms of a decommissioning requirement, or if something can happen that compromises the safety of something being recycled. I don't really have a great answer for you, honestly. I think that it's something that we're seeing of increasing interest again.
Right. And again, it's the evolving. The technology is going to keep doing this to us. So we need some sort of the state we need. And I'm just giving feedback, hopefully, to your boss's boss, right? Because the naysayers that would say, we're very idealistic in our CLCPA goals. So I want to be able to say to them, well, we're not. It's going to get recycled. It's going to last this long, like I say, with the panels, and even longer, right? We all know that they're still going. What do they have? A test study of panels installed in the 80s in California are still generating electricity. It's just, you want to have our ducks in a row, because this is the panels first, right? Now the batteries, maybe hydrogen. We have to always do the cost benefit, right? We're mining a lot of lithium here, right? And this is dangerous, as I was reminded again last night. So does that outweigh the fossil fuel? And I just need the state to really always study that in advance, so we don't play catch up.
I hear you loud and clear. I mean, a couple of things with the lithium. There's no question regarding the fire safety risk of lithium ion batteries, but it's not lithium metal; it's a lithium salt that's in those batteries. So it's not the same risks that you get with metallic lithium. Just want to hit that real quick. I hear you loud and clear. I couldn't agree more regarding the need to be precautionary in deployment of technologies and the need to be forward looking. And I do think that that's something that's happening industry wide. It's not just a New York problem. And it's a federal EPA thing as much as it is a state DEC or a NYSERDA thing. And I definitely think that, again, it's a space that we're going to see a lot of innovation. There's a lot of research currently happening with regard to material handling of clean energy technologies. And so I think it's a space to be excited about, and it's definitely something that I will make sure that we continue to look at on our team and elsewhere in NYSERDA.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Let's talk about some solar. The first thing to really hit on in terms of what has changed since, again, I want to be clear that many of you may have adopted solar laws in the past and you're looking at revisiting them. Maybe you're under a moratorium currently. Maybe you've got a solar law that you feel pretty good about, but we want to spend some time on some of the stuff that's changed. And one of the primary things that's changed since many people adopted solar laws is the jurisdiction of permitting in the state of New York. So we, as of 2020, there was a law that was passed which created a new state level siting office. also known as the Office of Renewable Energy Siting, which is tasked with permitting all renewable generating projects that are larger than 25 megawatts. So that means anything that is above 25 megawatts will be permitted at the state level. Projects which are below 25 megawatts remain in control at the municipal level. So that means that you're permitting a project in accordance with SEQR, the State Environmental Quality Review Act, as well as any municipal requirements that you have on the books, and that does remain the case. The change is that the process for permitting is no longer the Article 10 process, which was used to permit everything from solar to natural gas plants. Now it's just a dedicated renewable energy siting office. And then projects that are between 20 to 25 megawatts do have the eligibility of opting into a state level process or continuing to regulate at the local level. And for that reason, I think it's really important that municipalities consider adopting a law that is responsible for permitting everything from rooftop solar through large scale projects, because theoretically, if you're at a situation where a developer is choosing between a state level review process and staying local, I would want to make sure that I'm keeping them within my grasp of permitting, just because I think generally speaking, it's good to have control and not be, relying upon the state. Obviously, if it is a state level permitting process, you are still engaged and there are still financial mechanisms that enable you to participate in that process. But generally speaking, I do think it's good to prepare yourself when you're adopting a law to regulate all sizes and types of projects. So what is the model solar law and how does that help us here? Well, the model law is an all-inclusive ordinance intended to provide a thorough review process for all sizes and aspects of solar systems under local jurisdiction. So we intend it to be relevant for permitting everything from rooftop solar, again, through large-scale projects. And we are updating the model law to really make sure that we can do that. We've tried to do our best to make sure that this model law gives flexibility and customizability to municipalities that are adopting it. And by that, I mean, I have seen municipalities take this law and create a local zoning law that was extremely solar friendly and barely put up any obstruction to the development of projects. I've also seen municipalities that have taken the solar law and do a really restrictive law that made it very impossible or very difficult to build a project in the community. And on some level, I actually think that that's great, because it means that we were able to provide a resource that is not, slanted in one direction or the other, but is really a jumping off point for municipality to customize the resource to their community's needs. In terms of what you do with this local law, I highly recommend that you review it thoroughly and you examine, what's going on in your community, adopt regulations that make the most sense for your municipality by modifying or changing or adding to the law as you see fit. That said, before you can even get to adopting the law, there are some steps that you should take and that I would recommend that you consider, especially if you're just looking to update a zoning law that you'd already adopted. You don't necessarily want to be adopting regulations in response to something. It's all about proactivity. So some of the things that you can and should be doing before adopting a law include reviewing hosting capacity mapping tools to learn if and where solar projects are feasible. I'm sure that you covered some of this in that session with Scenic Hudson. And so you're going to see a reappearance of some of the takeaways from their solar mapping tool in just a minute. You can also consider amending your comprehensive plan before adopting or in concurrence with updating your solar law to make sure that you've got a strategy in place for municipality-wide development and that you're not, codifying changes under your local solar law without having them be in accordance with your comprehensive plan. It's good to conduct outreach with the community to make sure that you're looking for balance. So that means not just engaging, with one subset of your community when it comes to developing a solar law, but making sure that you're hearing what landowners want to be doing with their land and what neighbors are concerned about in their community and all of those kinds of things. You want to make sure that you're soliciting input from across the community. And finally, you can consider putting together a working group to conduct meetings on a community-wide basis, which seems like it's very much in alignment with what some of the material that Kate was discussing earlier regarding a dedicated body to focus on sustainability and climate issues. So that's definitely a good task for that group. In terms of hosting capacity mapping, I don't need to spend too much time given the amount of time we've got left, but really the point here is to visualize where solar can and is feasible based on a desktop analysis so that you are not adopting a law that only makes solar an allowable use in an area of the town where it's not even going to be feasible, just because that's not a great way of adopting a law and you're not likely to see a project. you definitely won't be likely to see the project that you want to see. So it's definitely a good thing to consider. And a hosting capacity map, it takes advantage of the utilities distribution level networking information. So basically it's an opportunity for you to see where and how a project can be added to the grid based on what's currently, how much room there currently is on the grid. I like to use a metaphor that the grid is like the vascular system of the human body, and that you've got arteries and you've got smaller veins. And these different, these different veins and arteries have a different amount of capacity for what can flow through them at any given time. And so these mapping tools are a way for you to visualize, how much room is there on at this level of the grid, and where can I add solar, where can't I? And you'll see it's a color-coded tool where the blues and greens tend to be areas of the grid that can take on additional capacity. And the reds represent areas that are pretty tapped for capacity, meaning you're not as likely to see a project built there based on the need for, substantial grid upgrades if you were going to build a project there. And so generally what I'll tend to do with the hosting capacity map is I like to do overlays, building upon the grid infrastructure with local zoning as a way of showing you where and how solar might be compatible with the existing zoning district. So this is an example of an overlay that I put together for a town where on the left, you start with just the distribution and transmission infrastructure. So you can see where all of the grid infrastructure in the community is. In the middle, you can see I layered on the community's zoning map. And then once you put those two pieces together, and there's other layers that you can and should consider as well. So the scenic Hudson mapping tool, I cannot recommend enough. You can add in, environmental layers like wetlands. You can add in agricultural layers so that you're making sure that you know where your prime soils are when it comes to, putting these together. And once you've got, some of those key criteria in mind, you can start to see the overlap and where solar feasibility aligns with, the types of areas that you want to see solar. For example, on the right, you can see in the middle there where there's some of the, the blue areas on the grid where there's a room for additional projects, that's in the hamlet area. And that's a place that that you're not going to have viability for a larger ground mounted solar energy system. So obviously you wouldn't want to make solar a viable use in the hamlet, but also in the surrounding parcels, because you want to be mindful of the the congruity with the adjoining land uses and things like that. But also overlaying these maps allows you to see that there are some pockets where there is solar feasibility or solar capacity in planned development districts, and a couple in industrial districts. So places where it's really a good idea to potentially be driving solar project development, and it helps you have a basis for where you want to make solar an allowable use in your zoning law. So yeah, highly recommend the scenic Hudson mapping tool. Unfortunately, you do still have to manually layer your zoning law over it, but that's something that I'm happy to help with, or other people that may be just as good as using rudimentary computer tools like I do. I do not pretend to be a whiz at this, so I'm sure anyone can help out with that, but I'm happy to help if that's of interest. Here's another example, but I think you guys kind of get it. Don't need to spend too much time here, but you can see here again, it's overlaying a zoning map with the distribution and transmission level infrastructure, and you can start to see where solar might be viable, and that can be the jumping off point for your zoning law. I don't need to spend much time on comprehensive planning, but again, it's really important to make sure that your zoning law is in congruence with your comprehensive plan. It's supposed to be adopted in accordance with your comprehensive plan. So definitely want to make sure that a solar or clean energy strategy is built into your comprehensive plan for when you adopt that into your zoning. You all probably know what land use moratoria are, so I don't need to spend time here as well. But again, it's going to be a local law or ordinance which suspends for a reasonable time a property owner's rights to obtain certain development approvals, such as solar. So we want to be careful that we're not using moratoria as a non-stop or unending obstruction to development, and we want to make sure that we're doing it in a reasonable time. Just because you need to provide some certainty to landowners and to industry as well for what you want to do with solar in your community. And hopefully these are tools that can help you to use that moratoria time to adopt a well-considered law. So I hope that it's helpful. One of the updates we're making to the model law chapter is to provide some information around different regulatory tools that communities can use when regulating solar. And the number one and sort of the default that we have in our model law is just to utilize a conventional zoning approach, because it's what most municipalities are going to be familiar with, and it's likely the easiest to implement and doesn't take too much time to take upfront or on an individual project review level. So conventional zoning would just utilize your existing division of lands, your existing zoning breakdown, much like you would for any other use. So really it's about, ensuring that you're treating solar much like you would any other use, whether that is a principal or accessory or a secondary use or a special use. So obviously you can still adopt solar specific criteria for project review, but it would be about integrating it into your existing zoning, ensuring adherence with existing bulk and area requirements, things like that. Another approach you could take is overlay zoning, which would utilize a defined overlay area that would be superimposed onto your zoning map. So an overlay zone would be basically a new district, much like a planned development district or something else that you are creating. It goes right onto your zoning map, and it allows you to very specifically define appropriate areas for solar based on the town's or the municipality's consideration. So if you were to do a hosting capacity analysis, like I said earlier, and you can really define that there are only a few key areas where solar is feasible, then perhaps you want to consider an overlay or a floating zone that really targets, those specific areas of feasibility while not needing to make solar an allowable use across the whole, industrial or residential district or something like that. So it allows you to be very specific about where you want to make it an allowable use. The challenge is that it really requires additional time and resources and work from staff up front to define that area, because keeping in mind, any place that you put the solar overlay zone means that, a landowner that's not in that zone technically is not able to go for solar. You could do a use variance and go through that process, but keeping in mind that you could potentially be closing the door to folks if you do an overlay zone and they're not included. So it's definitely going to take some time up front and public hearings and public input to make sure that you're doing it responsibly and not putting people in a bad position. And then finally, floating zones are another approach you could take as well, which are similar in concept to an overlay zone and sometimes are used interchangeably. But the difference is that a floating zone is not going to be something that you immediately add to your zoning map as another district like any other district. So a floating zone does also implement solar specific requirements, but you don't actually apply it to your map until a developer or a landowner applies for the creation of a floating zone. So basically, it's like adding a use variance step to your zoning approval. So it's really creating a two-step process. The first step would be the creation and approval of a floating zone, which would then get added to the parcel where you're looking to develop a project. And then it would go through the formal project review and approval process in accordance with your land use regulations. So we've definitely seen some communities across the state utilize overlay or floating zones. I don't know that I'm in a position to say whether that's appropriate or a good idea depending on the community, because I think it really varies a lot based on the staff that are actually in charge of administering these laws. I think some planning boards are perhaps more able or more interested in taking an approach like this. Others may prefer to utilize a conventional zoning approach. I don't know that there's a right or a wrong answer. I really think it depends on the community and their level of interest in taking one of those steps. So good for you to consider your options. Within the model law, and again, it does proceed with a conventional zoning approach here, but keep in mind that there are other ways to do it. We'll just sort of walk through the different sections of the model law, spending more time on some that I think are more important or perhaps more of interest rather. And again, I'll do my best to highlight the areas throughout where we've looked to consolidate or change things or add things based on the updates that we're making this time around. Much like any other law, you're going to want to state your authority. So you're going to be grounding the solar energy law in the municipal home rule law and the town, village, or city law sections as listed there. So you just want to make sure that you're choosing the right one. The statement of purpose, I think, is a really important piece here, because the reason for adopting or updating your zoning law can take a lot of different forms across the community. And there's sometimes conflicting things that you're looking to do within the zoning law, like preserving environmental or agricultural lands while promoting clean energy. Those may not inherently be contradictory, but we know in some cases that they can be. So it's good to keep in mind, all of the different sticky points that you're looking to accomplish with the solar law, and make sure that you're listing them here as a justification for what's to come in the law. So, you know, exactly like here, we're sort of hitting on some of that. You know, you want to make sure you're taking advantage of a safe, abundant, renewable energy source, while also, skipping down to number 4, mitigating the impacts of solar on environmental resources, such as priority agricultural lands, forests, things like that. You also can make sure that you're aligning your pursuit of clean energy and solar specifically with other goals of the community, such as, you know, maybe achieving the clean energy communities or climate smart communities grant funding, things like that. One of the key things that you need to do within your solar law is delineate between the types of solar energy projects and how you'd like to regulate them. And this is one of the areas where we're making some changes in the new version of the model law. So historically, we've utilized 3 tiers of solar. The first tier being tier 1, which is roof mounted and building integrated systems. Tier 2 historically was basically residential ground mount systems. So something that's serving an on-site use, it's sized appropriately to like a single family or a small multifamily residence. And it's providing, you know, again, on-site consumption for the electricity. And then previously, tier 3 was everything else. It was everything from, you know, larger non-residential solar systems all the way to a 25 megawatt, you know, 100-acre solar project. And I would say that, you know, those are projects that it's really hard to paint with such a broad brush. And so what we're looking to do here is we're going to be adding a 4th tier and sort of doing a little bit of changing to how we have the tiers 1 through 3 organized, whereby what we're looking to do is have tier 4 be the largest one, and that's going to be applying to large scale projects, which are larger than 5 megawatts. Tier 3 will apply to things up to the community solar sized projects. So anything from, you know, perhaps an acre up to 30 acres of a project. So a community solar project will typically occupy, you know, 25 to 35 acres. So that'll be its own tier under tier 3, rather than having those be in the same bucket as large scale projects. And then tiers 1 and 2 will continue to apply to, you know, residential and commercial systems. So we are making some changes there as well, but it's really the main focus here is that we're looking to differentiate between zoning for community solar projects and large scale projects, just because it's a very different type of use in terms of the cumulative acreage that it's taking up. So again, historically, this is what the breakdown was in the model law, tiers 1, 2, and 3, but we know that some of that's changed. I believe that at least one of the photos here on this slide is a project that's in Orange County. I think maybe even 2 of them. Some of the folks on the call here may know which one. But so yeah, a couple of photo examples of tier 1. So historically, it's really just been rooftop systems, whether that's residential or large scale. The reason being that, you know, they're not changing in terms of the land use impacts. So in our book, that it makes sense to regulate all of them as one tier, because you're not talking about something that's going to change the land use impact. You don't have to change a stormwater prevention plan. You don't have to change your secret determination. It's on a roof. It's an existing structure. It doesn't require the same level of stringent review by your planning board as a larger ground mounted system does. This is an example of a building integrated system. We don't see too many of these. Usually if you're going to get a system that's part of a building, it'll be rooftop, but sometimes you want to, you know, leave room for creative building design, which is happening more and more. Again, historically, tier 2 has been that residential scale ground mount systems. Under the new model law, it will allow for projects that are a bit bigger, but that are still tailored to on-site use, which means that you're allowing it, you know, for a relatively streamlined permitting process, less streamlined than tier 1, but relatively streamlined for projects that are serving a defined off-taker, meaning like a larger commercial operation or a school or something like that. Provides a somewhat streamlined process for them. They're still going to go through site plan, but it's a little bit less burdensome because you want to recognize that it's tied to an on-site use. It's not a commercial entity the way a larger scale project might be. And we definitely want to make sure that we're encouraging those types of projects in the state. And then tier 3 systems, again, historically, that was everything from community solar and larger. There's the new model law that will be limited to projects that are community solar sized, and then tier 4 will be for the larger projects. So the model law uses the following permitting methodology, whereby tiers 1 and tier 2 are permitted in all districts. There are allowable uses in all districts. Tier 2 being allowable as accessory structures, given that they're ground mounted. Those would be permitted using a building permit, And then the New York State Unified Solar Permit, which permits everything up to 25 kilowatt residential systems. So it allows for that streamlined process. And then tier 3 in the model law has used a special use permit and site plan review requirement. That'll still be the case for tiers 3 and 4. Only tier 4, that large scale project, will have an additional level of requirements it needs to adhere to given the size of the project and the implications of a project of that scale. The applicability section of the model law just emphasizes that these projects, or that this law is applicable to all projects that are going to be installed within the municipality, and making sure that it's applicable to any modifications to the system that result in a change of more than 5% of the project area or capacity, which is really important because you want to make sure that no one's going in and changing their project after the fact. You want to make sure that it's still, going through the local regulations to ensure code compliance and safety. And then you want to emphasize that, again, the state uniform code and any other applicable codes do apply here. In terms of general requirements, you're going to want to be requiring a building permit for all of the projects, making sure that you're accommodating solar energy systems and protecting access to sunlight, which is really important. You don't want to make sure that you're permitting a system and then immediately, allowing a use next door, which is going to impact the ability of that project that you already approved to generate or access sunlight. And then you're going to reemphasize the applicability of seeker rules to solar energy projects. And there are some specific places where solar projects specifically are treated a certain way under seeker in accordance with the seeker guidance from DEC. So you want to make sure that we're aligning with the requirements there. I mentioned that tiers 1 and 2 have a relatively streamlined permitting process, so I don't want to spend too much time here because I imagine that most of the questions or the places we want to spend time are for the larger tier systems. But tier 1, roof mounted, you want to make sure you're incorporating designs that address placement and tilt of panels on the pitched roof. So you want to make sure it's parallel to the roof, and it doesn't go beyond a certain distance between the roof and the panels. You want to make sure that there's a anti-reflective coating to reduce glare on these panels, which is an industry standard at this point that really comes on pretty much all of the panels. For tier 1 design requirements in the model law, we again make sure that the panels are parallel to the roof, that the distance between the highest point of the panel and the roof is a maximum of 8 inches to make sure it's not super obstructive visually. And you want to make sure it's not going beyond the highest point of the roof. And then on a flat roof, it shouldn't be extending beyond the parapet and no more than a couple of feet above the flat roof surface. Now, on a flat roof, it doesn't have to be parallel to the surface of the roof because potentially you may want to angle it to ensure that you are maximizing the amount of sun that's hitting the panels, as long as it's within the height requirements of the parapet on top of the roof. So tier 1 is relatively straightforward. Again, you can utilize the Unified Solar Permit, which Kat talked about earlier. That's eligible for Clean Energy Communities Program and Climate Smart Communities Program credit. So if you haven't already, it's pretty low-hanging fruit, and all it does is require your code enforcement officials to utilize a very streamlined permitting process that's consistent and allows for expedient review of projects. So highly recommend, if you haven't already, to utilize that resource. Tier 2. So again, in this instance, we've been talking about tier 2 is the residential ground mount systems, which will be slightly modified under the new version of the model law. But again, you've got the glare requirement, you have a screening and visibility requirement. You want to make sure that you're minimizing views from the adjacent properties to the extent reasonably practicable, which you can do through a couple of strategies. Number 1 would be adherence to underlying setback requirements, and then you can have fencing requirements and or just ensuring, to the extent practicable means that when that project comes up for review by your code enforcement official, that they have, screening in place, whether that's using existing vegetation or adding new vegetation to block that. Then you also have the underlying lot size requirements for residential systems as well, which are applicable to accessory structures and would be applicable to solar because that's how you are defining it in the model law. We also recommend utilizing tier 2 height requirements, which we have as smaller for tier 2 systems than we do for the larger projects, because these are systems that are serving residential uses, and they're more likely in the residential area where you don't want to be allowing something that's super, super high. So we recommend, as we do here in the model law, tailoring the height cap based on the type of district where you're allowing these projects to be permitted. So for residential districts, we've got that capped at 10 feet. for, commercial and industrial districts or places where you're less likely to be, have a high density residential uses. We recommend upping that to 15 feet, and you'll see that for larger projects, those numbers look a little bit different, but we'll get to that later. For tier 2, so for, again, residential systems, you want to make sure that you are adhering to setback requirements, and it's your call of whether you want to utilize your underlying zoning district requirements or if you want to adopt specific solar requirements. We offer both approaches in the model law. It's really up to, up to your discretion of which approach you want to take for permitting these systems. And now, tier 3, the fun part. Maybe before I move on, Carrie, any questions that we want to, or Kate, any questions that we want to take right now while we're wrapping up on the smaller projects? So again, residential into, small commercial systems. Any questions in the chat?
We do have a comment. One thing to keep in mind is large commercial structures can potentially be solar development viable for more than just that property. And then there is another one, the framework for ground mount systems utilize galvanized metal, makes the project look very industrial. Framework should be a color that will enable it to blend into the environment. A dark green is appropriate to achieve this goal.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be really curious to hear from folks' experience. In my experience, the places where you're able to see a bit more of harmony with, the environmental piece comes from the fencing more so than the actual equipment that's being used to mount the system. I'm sure that is not always the case, and so I would be really curious to hear if we've got municipalities who have, implemented an approach whereby the actual equipment that the panels are mounted on has been colored. Generally speaking, I definitely think that it's mostly a metal approach that's used, but I think that you could also look to adopt that by, codifying something in your requirement about, to the extent feasible, equipment shall be, shall look to harmonize with existing uses, including, coloring or something like that. And then you can work with the developer to ensure that they are doing that to the extent feasible and the extent affordable based on, the options that are out there. I've certainly seen that happen with fencing, where people have looked to use either more natural looking fencing or darker, like a green colored fencing that can help, blend in the project, especially in like a higher visibility area. And please feel free to share your experience in the chat if there are places that you've seen, utilize equipment that's actually green or something like that. I'd be very curious to hear.
So my one concern is when you start manipulating the foundation of the material, then that may remove the recyclability of it. Sounds like a dye would be a little thing. That's all I'm saying. So one thing I think you're going to cover, I just want to make sure, because we discussed it a little bit the last time in the Q&A, is the setback versus the trees. A lot of municipalities are doing a larger setback, thinking that helps with what I'm not quite certain, but we're seeing 100-foot setbacks in towns between the fence and the actual solar panel array. And I'm looking at that as marginalized land, and I'm hoping you can talk to that. I also want to make sure that the height, that we could be somewhat flexible on the height if there's a dual use to the solar. And then the last thing is the solar access for all. A lot of villages have struggled with whether it's ground mounts, whether it's rooftop mounts, because of the nature of the smaller lot. So those things, if you're getting there still, that would be good.
Yeah, I mean, most of those things we're still getting to because we've really only covered the tier 1 and 2 to date, with the exception there being the solar access for all, just because at this point we're going to be looking more towards the larger scale systems. I don't know that I have a great answer on that. Kate, were you going to hop in with that?
Well, no, I think that may have rolled off my tongue, solar access for all, because that's the program. Solar access, just in their code is what I meant to say. Just solar access being a right within their code is important to have in the definition section.
Yes, I definitely agree with that. And I believe beyond, my supporting that generally, I believe that that's part of the law. I can cite my sources on that. I can go back to that, but I believe that is part of the law in the state of New York. It's definitely something to consider. I'll admit that most of the work that I do around like land use with solar focuses on the larger ground mount implications, just because that's where we tend to see more of the conflict these days. And so I am not super familiar with any more innovative approaches that villages or other communities have looked to do around solar access. But if that's something that is of particular interest, I'm more than happy to dig in and do some research there and see if there's any unique approaches that communities are taking. In terms of the other stuff that you mentioned, like setbacks and co-utilization of the land or avoiding marginalized lands, we can certainly cover that. And some of that is going to be addressed in upcoming updates to the law, which I will talk about a little bit later as well.
We have one new question. Where does the county ag board notice fit in on approval process? Right now, we often hear about projects very late in the process. I don't know if you could speak to that, if that's going to be back at me.
No, it's a great question, and I'm happy to let you take a stab at that as well. But I think that that's something that you can certainly look to adopt in an updated zoning law. What I would say, particularly around like a large scale project, when you're getting to tier 3 or tier 4, these projects that are going to be situated often on green lands. I would recommend building that in as like an advisory opinion pretty early in the process. I think that that's something that once you've ensured that the application is complete, once your code enforcement or building staff have reviewed the application and made sure everything's in there, I think that having that be an advisory opinion that you do, as part of the site plan review process is a very doable thing. It's just something that you would have to go out and put in your law. But I think that that's a great idea. We've toyed with having that be, something like that in the agricultural resources section of the zoning law. And I do think that we have that in one of the commentary sections in our model law. So I think that's a great idea. Kate, I don't know if you have any other thoughts about where in the process that should go, but I generally would say that that is an early stage step that should be happening. You shouldn't be waiting until the project has been, fully gone through a site plan process before doing that.
We just don't have any standing. So a few years ago, when it became starting to get problematic with these large arrays and people would take notice and complain, there was an executive order that we were more concerned about the statewide soils. So that was integrated into Orange County, the 239 process that's highlighted on your screen, reviews. However, it still comes down to the host municipality to make sure and use the scenic Hudson solar toolkit that has the soils in it to say, no, you're not going to go on the prime land soils. That's perfect for farming. We want to protect that for agricultural, for open space, for the economy. We're going to direct you this way. And that's why it's so important for everyone on this call to really let's act on all of this, because that's what you want to protect. Otherwise, they're just going to come in and go where they go.
Yeah, it sounds like the question is particularly around like adding an advisory check too for the county ag board. And so, yeah, I think that that's something that you could have, codified in early stages of the process approval as well. So in addition to municipalities having protections in the law regarding, prime soil coverage and things like that, even as like that is undergoing review at the local level, you can also ensure that it's getting kicked to the county for their review as well. So I would say having that be an early stage of the project review is a good thing. I'm happy to share some sort of draft language around that. Can put that together if that's of particular interest as well.
That would be great. I'd love that. Please send that to me. I'll email you tomorrow and annoy you.
Please remind me. Yes, please remind me.
The one other thing though is, where is Ag and Markets Department, the New York State Department of Ag and Markets? They were a little gun shy again years ago when this started happening. They weren't helping. Have they developed any finer line in the sand? Is there more structure there? Are they defining a solar farm, et cetera? Please, sorry.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I do I'll answer that now. I also want to make sure that we get through the material we have to cover to get you guys your points for the county training. So let's do this on the ag, and then we can circle back to the ag once we get to that section of the presentation. There are two working groups that are currently active around agriculture and solar in the state. There's the Farmland Protection Working Group, which is the leaders of state agencies, including NYSERDA, Ag and Markets, DVC, and others who are involved in promulgating some strategies to, help promote balance between the two. So Ag and Markets is extremely active on this right now, and they are going to be making recommendations in conjunction with these other agencies in the near future. I think that they're working on the draft of the recommendations right now. There's also the Agricultural Technical Working Group, which is NYSERDA led, which is focused on many things, including dual use and strategies for agricultural impact mitigation. They're working on some research projects, which are really exciting. Obviously, dual use is of particular interest to Kate with the thumbs up there, as well as myself and our team here. And we can talk a little bit about what dual use means, in a few minutes. But Ag and Markets has done a lot. They've also, in the last couple of years, they've put together guidelines which are extremely prescriptive around the commissioning, construction, and decommissioning of solar projects on agricultural lands, which our model law recommends you build into your municipal regulations to require developers building projects on agricultural lands to adhere to those regulations from Ag and Markets. So they're very active. I think that there remain some issues that need to be addressed by Ag and Markets and NYSERDA and others. There's no question that they haven't found the secret sauce to promoting a perfect balance yet, but we're all still working on it, and Ag and Markets is very much a part of those discussions. I know
you said to go on, but this lends itself, and maybe you'll get to it with the dual uses, but the question is about the model where solar and agriculture fit together. Most solar companies plant low growth grasses for easy maintenance. Perhaps proper layout and planning would allow for the land beneath the panels to be used productively instead. And I just want to say, Andrew, that's what I said, that municipalities could be forgiving on the height. And that's what Ian's going to talk about, is the dual, but not just grasses. Grasses need to be mowed, but pollinator plants is something that the New York State former Governor Cuomo came out with the executive order in June. What was that? 2017, they all blend, and asked for pollinators to be planted. So it is something that's happening, and I'm not going to steal your thunder about the dual use. So please continue, Ian.
Yeah, no problem. The thunder is, I'm happy to share it because dual use is very exciting. But to that point, that's exactly what we're looking to promote here is, a land management strategy that's rooted in environmentalism and sustainability, and is not relying on, you're not trading a monocrop from anything to just be a grass that's solely serving as ground cover and is not something that's contributing to the health of the environment around it. And it's certainly doable. And we've seen projects across the state utilize pollinator friendly approaches. We've seen seed mixes that are specifically designed for sheep that graze under the panel instead of, requiring mowing. There's a number of strategies you can take that, aren't directly addressed in this presentation because this is, it needs some updating with the law. But again, there's some language that I can share that we've got in the updated version of the model law, which allow for things like modification of bulk and area requirements for projects that are implementing, a co-location activity or something like that. So there are definitely steps that you can take at the local level to promote that type of activity. I tell you what, I will breeze through some of this material that I think is particularly not stale, but something that we're all familiar with, and make sure that we have time for some of these more important questions at the end. I just know we're a little bit tight for time. So the model law, tier 3. So again, historically, this is everything from, larger than residential systems, from everywhere from like community solar through large scale projects. And we're going to be honing that in a bit more in the updated version. But the process is really, you're going to choose which zoning districts are, appropriate for these systems, define a reasonable timeline for reviewing the application for completeness, which for a large scale project, in my opinion, 10 days is not enough. I think that you got to go larger than that. So we do in the updated version of the law. You also lay out your, requirements for the public hearing process and everything like that. Now, historically for tier 3 requirements, we've had a handful of things that they have to adhere to. So undergrounding requirements, so making sure that, to the extent practicable, they're not adding a lot of above ground utilities outside of the facility area. Vehicular paths, so minimizing the amount of impervious surface creation on site at the project. You want to make sure that you're not, compacting land or adding any like excess vehicular paths that aren't needed, but you also do want to make sure that you're allowing for reasonable site access, including for first responders if something were to happen, things like that. Signage, glare, those are relatively straightforward things, but you want to make sure you're adhering to the uniform code requirements for signage. Lighting, you want to make sure that you're not creating any new source of light pollution with the lighting on site of the project. So usually that means using downcast lighting. It's a relatively easy thing to include, from the outset, and just make sure that you're not running into that issue down the line. Tree cutting. Kate, I know you want to talk about tree cutting, so let's make sure that we're having municipalities address tree cutting in the law. You can specify, whether that is, I've seen approaches, I think we talked about this in the comprehensive plan webinar, that, sometimes people take the approach of, you can't minimize the extent that you're going to allow tree cutting beyond, a certain circumference of the tree. Maybe that's, or a diameter of the tree. Maybe that's a 6-inch diameter. If it's beyond that, you need to minimize the amount of tree cutting you're doing, things like that. I think generally speaking, you want to encourage these projects to be sited in the area to minimize that anyway, but it's also good to include, something in your law that's minimizing it to the extent practicable. Just because otherwise, if you don't have that requirement, they're free to do what they need to do to, create a facility area where they can build a project. We also include decommissioning requirements, site plan application standards, special use permit standards, and contingencies for ownership changes of the project. We'll spend a little bit of time on a couple of these, but I know we want to get to some of the other things as well. So undergrounding requirements and vehicular paths, I talked about that, but you just want to make sure that you are, allowing the reasonable site access that you need to, but not creating any excess impervious surfaces, just because that's going to affect, stormwater runoff in a way that otherwise a solar project doesn't really affect runoff in the same way. Yep. Hello. You've got the signage piece. So again, making sure that you're aligning with the uniform code requirements for signage for solar. So there are specific requirements that are in place. Again, lighting, you want to make sure you're doing downcast lighting. And then again, in our model law, we utilize a tree clearing requirement that says you should minimize the removal of trees that are larger than 6 inches in diameter. I've seen some other approaches as well, but I think that that's a pretty straightforward way to make sure that you're minimizing the clear cutting that may need to happen. Although we should already be encouraging projects to be going to areas where that's not going to be a concern in the first place. Decommissioning is extremely important. If nothing else, I'd say this is maybe one of, if not the most important takeaways, that you should make sure that your solar law has decommissioning requirements built into it. So you want to make sure that if and when a project reaches the end of its useful life, that the municipality is not the one responsible for decommissioning the system. Or if the municipality does become responsible for decommissioning the system, that there is money set aside to ensure that that does not come from the municipal budget. So what that means is that upfront, you should be requiring an applicant to provide a thorough decommissioning plan, which includes itemized tasks necessary to accomplish decommissioning and the cost and time of completing those steps of decommissioning the system. As well as any plan to repair damage, if something were to happen, maybe there's a natural event that causes some damage to some of the panels, they should have a process in place for cleaning up the site. You also want to make sure that they're providing a financial surety to cover the cost of decommissioning. So usually I would say that takes the form of a bond or a letter of credit. There's some room in there whereby I would recommend having your municipal attorney, really closely read this and understand what the municipality's preference is. Generally speaking, cash escrow accounts are not a great way from the development perspective in terms of providing that up front, just because that severely increases the cost of developing the project up front. Whereas a bond or a letter of credit can accomplish the same goal of making sure the municipality has their potential funds covered if and when they have to decommission the system, but it's something that can be mutually agreeable for all parties. You also want to make sure that you are oversizing the decommissioning cost requirement. So we recommend going to 115 or 125% of the cost of system removal, as well as including some type of mechanism that allows for that cost to change over time. So there's sort of two ways that you can go with that. You can include a cost escalator, which utilizes a fixed increase over time. So let's say, you're going to require 2% annual increase for the life of the project. Alternatively, you can build in a requirement that says that you'll just revisit the cost estimate on a periodic basis. to allow for, a more accurate sense of the decommissioning cost, because inflation does not increase 2% every year. Sometimes it's a lot more, sometimes it's less, sometimes it's not. And so, perhaps you want to take the approach of, the decommissioning security is going to be 125%, and it will be revisited every 5 years to account for any change in project costs. Those are two approaches that we've seen adopted, in both ways. And I think as long as you're making sure that there's a mechanism to address changing costs over time, then you're covered. Yeah, decommissioning, very important. Make sure it's in there. Site plan requirements. A lot of this stuff is pretty in line with, any type of site plan that you're going to be reviewing or requiring that's going to be coming before the planning board for review. So you want to make sure that you're documenting any property lines and physical features of the site, any changes that the developer is proposing in terms of grading or landscaping. You want the electrical information, including spec sheets and the diagram showing that it's going to be, making sure that your engineer and or your code enforcement folks are able to verify that everything's in good shape. You want contact information for site ownership, as well as the folks responsible for maintaining the site, so that if and when, any work needs to be done throughout the life of the project, that you've got that information on hand. A property operation and maintenance plan is particularly important, especially if you're going to be utilizing any type of, dual use of the site. So anytime that you expect people to be going in and out of the facility area on a regular basis, or let's say potentially a project is looking to use, sheep grazing instead of traditional landscaping or maintenance, you want to make sure that the operation and maintenance plan very clearly spells out, what the ongoing maintenance of the site will include. And then you also want to be requiring any, seeker compliance documents such as erosion and sediment control plans, as well as making sure that all of the project documentation is signed and sealed, or signed and stamped rather, by a licensed professional engineer or architect in the state of New York. For Tier 3 permit standards, so our law provides a few different standards. So we utilize lot size, height, and setbacks for Tier 3 solar energy systems. That's not changing, although we are adding some setbacks for those really large scale projects, and I'll talk about that in just a second. For lot size, again, there's sort of two approaches. You can do the underlying zoning requirement sizes, or you can utilize a specific size for solar energy systems specifically. So an example here in the table at the bottom would be doing a solar energy specific bulk and area requirement. So we utilize, a minimum lot size that's a lot lower in residential, like higher density residential areas. You increase the lot size requirement for commercial and business or agricultural residential zones. We don't recommend, or our law does not implement a minimum lot size for industrial districts, just based on the character of the area. And then obviously you can see that we don't allow for, these Tier 3 systems in high density residential neighborhoods. So this is just one of the approaches you can take, or you can utilize the underlying requirements. Excuse me. For system height, given that these are larger projects, again, you can use the underlying height limitations if you want, or you can adopt specific height requirements that are applicable to solar, just based on the fact that solar is a different type of development than other special uses that you're allowing in a district. So potentially the other, height requirements are like 30 feet or 40 feet, and that's definitely not going to be applicable to a solar facility. So maybe you want to be a bit more prescriptive. Maybe it's 15 and 20 feet. If you're allowing, up to 20 feet, you could also include, like Kate said earlier, a provision in the law here which allows, explicitly allows for the modification of bulk and area standards for projects utilizing, an agricultural co-location activity. So something like that would say, if you're going to use the area underneath the panels to graze sheep or to, grow crops or something like that, that you'd be able to go above that 15 or 20 feet standard, so that you can have, agricultural equipment passing underneath it or people working underneath it. Those are approaches that you can take. Now, I'll note that, dual uses are in relatively early phases, depending on the type of dual use, especially for crop cultivation underneath panels. So you may include that provision in your law. It doesn't mean that you're going to be able to, see it to fruition in the near future, because those things are all very much still under a research phase in terms of the efficacy of those approaches on the solar project. Most crop production projects are happening in like university settings. They're not things that are happening on the large scale, but they're definitely of interest, and there's a lot of work happening in the space. I'll take a break in just a second, but I want to talk about setbacks, which is the next thing here. So again, you can use the underlying zoning approach, or you can adopt solar specific setbacks, which I think is probably a pretty relevant approach and something that many of you are probably dealing with. So the approach that we offer in the table at the bottom utilizes, solar specific setbacks in each zoning district. So obviously the setbacks are much higher in the residential, more dense residential districts, while being a bit more generous in the commercial and industrial areas, as well as agricultural residential in this case, where the parcels are a lot bigger. So one setback that's not listed on the screen here, but is something that we're going to be putting in the updated law, is going to be a setback that's not a parcel line setback, but rather a setback to the actual residence on the adjacent parcel. And so the idea here is to make sure that you're putting adequate space, not just from your neighbor, you and your neighbor's parcel line, but actually to your neighbor themselves by implementing a setback that's going to be from the panels to your neighbor's residence. And that's an approach that was taken by the State Office of Renewable Energy Siting when they were adopting their regulations. And we think that that's a great idea to make sure that, you're putting an adequate amount of space to allow for, not having a project right up against your neighbor's house. Because, sometimes, the dwelling might be near the parcel line. Sometimes it's going to be further out to the parcel line, whereby, it doesn't matter as much what the setback is to the parcel line, but you want to make sure that you're allowing for enough space. I think that there were a couple of questions that came in, so I'll just take a quick pause real quick while being mindful of time. Kate or Carrie, are there a couple questions that you want to throw in right now while we're talking about the special use permit standards? And if we lost Kate, I can try and pull my chat up here and go through that.
It
No,
does look
Kate is
like-
here. Go ahead,
Hi,
Carrie.
Kate.
Go
It
ahead,
just looks
Carrie.
like a couple of comments going back and forth on the pollinators.
Right.
I mean, Kate may be able to notate a little bit better. Some of them actually came from her, so.
Yeah, we're just
Yeah, some
using the
valid
chat
points.
to the function. We're talking about how the county pays $5,000 or more to mow. So I explained, different things. We can, nothing riveting that can't wait. So let's keep moving, and we can bring you up to speed when you stop, if that is okay. If Carrie, I'm seeing that right?
You are absolutely correct. There are no questions in the chat.
Okay.
Just the fun, just the discourse, which I will be happy to get to. So let me continue through here. So lot coverage is an interesting topic when it comes to solar, because historically, as many of you probably know, lot coverage has really focused on impervious surface mitigation, basically like minimizing the amount of space that you are occupying with impervious surfaces. For those, if there's anyone here who doesn't know what that means, basically, where can water be absorbed into the ground? Where can it not? Where are you paving? Where are you, putting up surfaces that don't allow for, the dissemination of water into the ground? Solar arrays are a really interesting technology because while they do occupy, a footprint, they're spaced out and they are angled in such a way that the ground below the panels is always able to absorb the water. Really, the only impervious surfaces that you're talking about with a solar facility are going to be, paved or even gravel access roads, mechanical equipment pads. So sometimes they'll have to pour some concrete pads to house like the inverters or other pieces of mechanical equipment associated with the array. But generally speaking, it's a very small proportion of the actual facility area. And so lot coverage tends to not really be a super helpful way of, gauging or applying to a solar project. Often we see lot coverage used more as a proxy for like project density and or in place of setback requirements. And so again, I think it's really important that we're using these tools correctly and adopting or modifying our other tools to account for that. So I would recommend that, rather than adopting a lot coverage percentage or a lot coverage standard based on the surface area of the panels or like the total, footprint of the project, I would recommend that you look to regulate systems using setbacks or other requirements rather than lot coverage, just because I think the way it's written, lot coverage is not a super appropriate tool for solar. If you do want to use lot coverage, the way that we have it here defined in the model law utilizes the existing requirements, but it really does focus on the impervious surfaces. So you're only talking about the foundations and where they're impacting the ground. You're talking about the mechanical equipment, and then you're talking about paved access roads. So our definition does not utilize the surface area of the panels because that is not an impervious surface. At least it's not for the sake of, covering the ground. So using that definition, we would say lot coverage shouldn't exceed the maximum lot coverage requirement for the underlying district. Many municipalities have taken the approach where you say, all of the surface area of the panel is included and that can't occupy more than X% of the facility area. That is an approach that you can take. I just think that, if that is the approach you want to take, you want to be really mindful of, the percentage that you're choosing, because you are in effect using, lot coverage as a proxy for density, which is what setbacks are for. At least that's one of the purposes of setbacks. So something to consider. Fencing is really important. And this is another area where you can talk about the blending, the harmonization with existing uses or with the surrounding area. So there are requirements that the National Electric Code requires that projects be surrounded by a self-locking gate and supposed to be at least 7 feet high. Now you can go beyond that and you can have additional requirements that say beyond, aligning with the NEC. So perhaps you're encouraging or, forcefully requiring a developer to utilize a fence that is, in alignment with, existing area, or you can have a requirement that says like the developer in consultation with the planning board, will develop a fencing strategy that aligns with, surrounding uses or something like that. Because I've seen fences that utilize, wooden posts and, wire instead of the chain link fence. I've seen fencing that utilizes, slats. I think that you want to afford yourself some flexibility to really customize the project based on, the planning board's work and the community's preferences. You don't necessarily want to force people to use one particular type of fencing, but you can certainly look to include language here that requires them to, put forth a fencing plan that is more aligned with, existing uses in the area or existing fencing in the area. One of the other things that Kate mentioned earlier was the concern about fencing and what you're doing with any like marginal land between the fence and the panels, or between, in the setback. I would very much say that you can make sure in your law that you specify that screening and plantings can occur within the setback, so that it's not marginalized space that can't be used for anything, especially if it's going to be on agricultural land. You want to minimize the amount of land that's being taken out of production. And so one of the ways to do that can be to allow for, a minimization of, setbacks, or allowing, plantings or vegetation and screening to occur within the setbacks. I think that that's definitely a very important thing that we want to see. You want to avoid, marginalizing any land that you can avoid. Screening and visibility, this requirement in the model law is really about aligning with seeker, whereby systems that are less than 10 acres in size, you do have to minimize the views, and you need to use appropriate architectural or landscaping features to minimize impacts. For systems that are larger than 10 acres in size, you have an additional requirement, which is visual impact assessments that are required under seeker to analyze visual impacts. Sometimes it's a line of sight analysis or visual modeling that they need to do. So you can require more stringent plans up front in terms of visual impacts for these larger projects. You want to make sure that the landscaping and screening plan includes a number of very specific things, which includes the types of plants that they'll be utilizing for screening. And some of that you can specify in your law. You can specify the types of plants or the maturity of plants that you need to see in order to screen a project, just because, not all projects are created equally. And if a project is going to propose itself in an area that doesn't have great existing screening, like you can see on the right here, the project on the bottom right is an example of one where, on 3 sides, it's covered by existing screening. And like, it's great. It means you're not going to have as much, visual impact. You can also see there's a road that goes right near the project whereby they were able to leave, enough of a buffer with, the trees there, as well as probably add some existing plantings to make sure that they're minimizing that impact to the extent possible. The project on the top right, however, you can see is an example where, they had to do probably a fair amount of clearing or grading to make sure that it was going to be equal land for the development of the project. And you can see they've planted a line of trees there. Now, from our vantage point where the photo is being taken, it doesn't really look like those trees are doing much of anything. Over the course of a couple of years, as those trees mature, they will, do more. However, you can require, to the extent practicable, more mature plantings. I'll note that the cost of doing that becomes, much more expensive the older and larger the trees get. So you do want to be, again, wary of that or mindful of that at least. But I think that it's a good thing to allow yourself for some flexibility. So I would say that, again, in the screening and landscaping plan, you can encourage developers to, work with the planning board to put together an approach that is in, compliance with surrounding uses and things like that. It looks like Kate's ready to jump in. What's going on, Kate?
Yep, you know that. All right, so yes, and you left out the word maintenance. You can also keep them, like with any development project, hold them accountable for 5 years or so for the maintenance to ensure that the trees live. But
Absolutely.
unfortunately, the upper right picture is basically, monoculture. It's just all one species that gives nothing back. It may be native to our area, which would be great, but it doesn't help our habitat. So we definitely want to ask for a bunch. It also doesn't need a single line. If you want the conifer look, you put the conifer on the outside, and then on the inside to make sure the growth doesn't overhang or obstruct the arrays, you can now put significant pollinator bushes, whether you want to put your native dogwoods or something larger, not huge trees, but something native and additional for animal life. And then the fence, and then there's that 100-foot mark buffer again that I just questioned. The other thing with the trees and with these solar, and I don't know if you're going to talk about this, Ian, I think we talked about it once before, is what I see a lot in my office is there's usually a waterway somewhere on the property. And what they do is they'll say, oh, they're taking down, they'll leave some of the trees, they'll protect the buffer by the waterway. If it's DEC wetland, they'll leave 100 feet mandatory buffer. But unfortunately, this is still allowing the clearing of most of the trees is still heating up the water, leaving and going into the waterway, raising thermal load of the water body. And that's a concern. So it's something I don't think we have the answer to yet, but it's something, again, back to citing, saying you shouldn't really be here. You should be over here. Stay in, go to your brownfields and already developed areas. And I think that's it. Back to the screening. I do want to say the wetlands, the wildlife, I should say, when you do a fence, which I know other large developments out west do not necessarily have fences, but here we do. We want to include wildlife. We'd like to lift it off the ground a foot to let the wildlife get in, get through. And the reason is, again, imagine you're taking out acres and acres of property, fencing it in. And where are those animals that used to live? Where are they going? On the bottom right, they're going to those houses that are nearby. And that's not fair. Again, that's what planning does, is we make sure we look at it from everything. It's not fair to those property owners that they are burdened with the nuisance of all of the animals that have to go around this sometimes 100 acres at this point fencing that locks them out. So we are seeing some very small holes, maybe every 100 feet. We need more of that. Or just the developer saves money. If you take it a foot off the ground and you buy yourself a 6-foot fence, you get the 7-foot height. And meanwhile, the opening is there for animals. So
yeah, and the only thing not mentioned in that's a great summary, Kate. The only other thing is for larger projects, you can encourage or require the use of corridors for larger game that cannot fit under the fencing. Obviously, that it's not something that's going to be super applicable or reasonable for like a community solar sized project, but for a really large scale project, depending on the configuration of the project. You mentioned out west, the big solar projects that you'll see out west, especially, I think out towards like California, if we're going that far west, if you'll bear with me.
That's what I am.
Yeah, so a lot of the projects in the grasslands in California that are really large will utilize, corridors whereby pronghorn and antelope, or pronghorn and deer rather, are able to pass through the project area, which is great. I mean, I think, I don't know that it's not a replacement for, the impact on their habitat, but it's a good way of making sure that you're not, fully cutting off migration patterns or things like that. Now, I think that that's less of an issue in New York based on the types of projects and the layout of projects that you're going to be seeing in the state of New York, but it's definitely something to be considered based on the facility area. And that's something that I think is really, again, it's getting into, site specific studies and things that need to happen. Obviously, when projects are cited at the state level citing process, which, a large scale project is, if it's over 25 megawatts, if it's big enough to really need a wildlife corridor, it's going to be permitted at the state level. And part of that state level process is going to be like a really robust review of the environmental considerations on site, including wildlife. So it's definitely something that would be considered by DEC and ORES when it's going through a state level permitting process.
Now, there's two things I would like to say about that. Here, we're more worried because we have more of the residential. We have the density that we should be concerned about our neighbors and the effect. Up north, where most of these big projects are going, and we're so lucky for that, we don't have the size property. We were very hip to solar a few years ago. The big projects are going more north, and I'm glad to hear that they're offering these wildlife corridors. The wildlife crossing should be in a lot of different applications and planning. And if people want to know more about that, that is something that's been happening again in other areas where there's even bridges over to get animals away from the neighborhood and to safely deliver them and cross them over roads. I will say that John Tracy reminded us that clay and rocky soils are impervious too. They are, however, they can slowly recharge. And that's what we're talking about, is recharging the groundwater. And Andrew also brought up, back to the equipment cabinets, he had brought up that sometimes they make a noise. I had explained that they're always in the middle of the arrays. And he brought up that he has seen them out where the utility service typically connects along the access road to the site, and sometimes quite close to neighboring homes. Not sure if you can speak to that.
I mean, I'd say if that's a concern, that I would consider an additional setback requirement. I don't know that I've seen that concern raised particularly, but I think if that's something that you're concerned, there's no reason that you couldn't add that as an additional requirement, which would say something to the effect of, mechanical. I mean, basically, it would be like mechanical equipment associated with the project must conform to the same setback requirements as the panels. I mean, basically.
And a site design question could be there as well, that it should be in the center.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think that, to some degree, it's hard to say, exactly the configuration of a project and what it should look like without knowing the site specific, layout and
Right.
where access roads are and everything like that. So I think generally it's easier to try and adhere to, putting a minimum buffer between, neighbors of a project and things like that. So I think that's very doable. I think you could even specify in your setbacks that it's, those setbacks are applicable to mechanical equipment, and you could even just save yourself a step of adding a separate setback by just making it applicable to, associated mechanical equipment. And that's again where, we're adding this other setback that's not a parcel line setback. It's a neighboring residence setback, which I think is something I would encourage everyone to do, especially for larger projects. Just to make sure that you're minimizing any risk of any noise, because it's not a loud noise, but there is the inverters specifically have a hum when they're generating electricity and stepping it up to go into the grid. So I would recommend that if that's something that you're concerned about, look to build that into your setbacks. Well, we got a couple more things, but I think we've talked about a lot of it, and I know that we're almost out of time. Want to be respectful of people's evenings. Agricultural protection, agricultural impact mitigation. A couple of things that we really encourage you to consider putting in your law. I'm going to jump down to one towards the bottom of the list because that requires less discussion. Requiring adherence to the Ag and Markets construction and decommissioning mitigation guidelines for solar. I highly recommend that everyone put this in their law, because basically this is saying, Ag and Markets has put out a prescriptive document outlining the steps that you should take to minimize impacts on agricultural lands. If you're going to build a project on ag lands, you have to adhere to these requirements. I think that that is a really good thing to include in your law, and I would recommend that you do so. You can also here require caps on the amount of the project that is cited on your priority agricultural lands. So historically in New York State, that has meant for solar using a prime farmland or farmland of statewide importance approach. Ag and Markets more recently in terms of solar has pivoted to utilizing its mineral soil groups approach, which means that we're now going to be using the same approach as we do for agricultural districts and agricultural assessments, whereby basically based on the soil group, the mineral soil group, that decides what the productivity of your soil is and how much of how valuable that soil is relative to the other soil groups in the state. So the more recent approach that's in the updated model law utilizes mineral soil groups 1 through 4, which basically maps to prime farmland. It's a pretty close proxy, but it uses the methodology that Ag and Markets themselves use, which is why we're going to be utilizing MSG 1 through 4 instead of prime soils. But you can still use prime or statewide importance at the local level. It's really just your priority and the language that you're familiar with and the mapping that you're familiar with. Like my understanding is the scenic Hudson mapping tool is going to use prime farmland and statewide importance farmland. I don't think it uses MSG 1 through 4, but again, we think it's good to be aligned with what Ag and Markets is using. So that's why we do mineral soil groups 1 through 4. And any of your, your county or regional soil offices will be able to get you those MSG 1 through 4 maps. It's not just the prime that they use. But anywho, the reason for talking about that classification is that you can utilize a cap on the total percentage of the project that can be occupying that priority farmland, or you can even require like one of the approaches that we're going to take in the updated law is that we're going to say you cannot occupy more than 50, let's say it's 50% of the mineral soil groups 1 through 4 on the parcel, and then we'll have an exception whereby, much like with the height requirement that Kate was talking about earlier, you can go above that number if you are utilizing a continued agricultural use of that land. So let's say you're continuing to farm underneath or in proximity to the panels, then you can modify the amount of agricultural land that you're occupying with the project. Similarly, if you decide that you're going to graze sheep and be in congruence with like a local sheep farmer for maintenance of the site, then that can allow you to modify the requirements as well. So I definitely think that it's worth considering. You want to make sure that you're capping or minimizing the impact on agricultural lands on a project by project basis, even if you're already taking the steps up front to drive development away from agricultural areas. You want to make sure that you're still providing yourself a check to control projects on an individual basis. Some photos here of an example of some good and some bad with regard to sheep grazing. So you can see here that they're utilizing, again, relatively low height seed mixes. And this is an example of some temporary fencing that's set up throughout the solar array, because basically when they graze these sheep, they do it on a rotational basis around the project. And so they'll set up these temporary fencing within the site area where they're going to keep the sheep and rotate them throughout the project, over time throughout the year. It's a really cool strategy that may or may not be feasible everywhere based on the distance from a sheep farmer or other considerations. But we would recommend, again, if you want to set, have a provision in your law, and I can send some sample language to Kate, which she can share with you all, allowing folks to modify certain requirements within their law based on the implementation of a dual use activity. I think that that's a really great approach, and that's something that we're going to have in the updated model law. So sheep grazing is one of those approaches. It can also be pollinator friendly planting. It can be crop production. Some really interesting approaches that you can encourage people to do. The final couple small sections, and again, I think we may have some continued discussion or questions, but you want to hit on the safety requirements, so making sure again that you're in compliance with the local codes and state level codes for solar. making sure everything is in working order in accordance with industry standards, and then requirements for batteries. Now, I recommend that you consider adopting, if you haven't already, a dedicated battery energy storage system law as well, just because this, batteries have come a long way, and it's definitely worth, focusing on them and familiarizing yourself with the land use impacts. So we do have a section in the law that talks about the batteries that are paired with solar, but I think that it's worth doing a separate law for that as well. Especially because not all batteries will be co-located with solar, so you want to have your bases covered. Permit timeframe and abandonment, you want to make sure that you are allowing for a longer, basically just allowing the permit to be valid for the time it takes for them to go through the interconnection and approval processes. As we know, larger solar projects can take years to go through the interconnection and development process. So you want to make sure that anytime a permit is issued, that it's going to be responsible for the amount of time it takes to develop a project. And then you want to have, provisions in place that will trigger the decommissioning or abandonment of the system. And so that includes, basically for us, it's, if you cease to produce electricity for a year, you're going to trigger the decommissioning process, which means that the town is going to notify you that you're going to implement decommissioning, and then you give the time frame for what that will look like. And then finally, the law has an enforcement and severability clause at the end as well, just to make sure that the law is, able to be enforced by the municipality. I've mentioned some of these changes, and I apologize. I know I'm moving quickly. I just want to be respectful of your time this evening. We are adding some content to the front of the model law chapter to address, floating and overlay zones and alternative approaches to conventional zoning. We are adding, again, a tier 4 to the law to distinguish between community and large scale solar, which I would highly recommend you do, just because the scale of the impact of these projects is very different. Obviously, for you guys in Orange County, you're not seeing so much on the large scale solar side, but I would still recommend you consider having regulations in place for large scale solar, just in case a project does come, especially if you're a community that is less residential, more agricultural. We are also reformatting and reorganizing parts of the model law to distinguish between special use permit standards and site plan approval requirements, because those are not the same thing, but previously our model law has kind of commingled them. I mentioned this earlier, but we're looking to align with standards and methodologies that are used by Ag and Markets, as well as the Office of Renewable Energy Siting and other state agencies. So I think it's a great thing to have your laws be in alignment with the best practices and standards being used by agencies across the state. So you can consider doing that as well. And then finally, we are doing a much more robust decommissioning plan template, so that the municipalities have a pretty thorough decommissioning plan requirement that they can hand to the developers or expect from the developers when it comes time for them to submit an application to the town, because decommissioning is incredibly important, and you want to make sure that the town is not the one in the dark when it comes time to remove the system. With that, we are already a few minutes over, so we don't have too much time for dedicated Q&A at the end, but I think we did a good job of intermixing that throughout. Are there any additional questions or comments that have come in the chat, or are there anything, does anyone want to, hop off mute and share a question or anything like that? I'm happy to stick around for a couple more minutes, but I know that people probably want to get on with their evenings. So I will end there unless there's anything else.
There are no additional questions in the chat unless anybody has any they would like to add.
Sharon says she cannot wait to see all the sheep farmers. I am with you there, Sharon. It's been a really cool development, honestly, to see. And New York is actually home to the American Solar Grazing Association, or ASGA, which is located up in central New York. They are doing a really good job of matching sheep farmers in the state of New York and elsewhere in the country with projects that are looking to implement sheep grazing. They've also developed seed mixes that are ideal for sheep, as well as for regenerative environmental practices. So they're utilizing like local forbs and clovers and all of that kind of stuff. Really cool work, and I share your excitement. We love to see the sheep. They're very cute, and they're cuter than men with weed whackers on the solar site. So I'm with you. And I know that there were a couple of questions or places where Kate expressed interest in some model language that can be shared with people. So Kate, please follow up with me. I'm happy to help. We've definitely got language that's not included in the presentation here because again, we are finalizing updates to the model law. I'll share that that is currently under review with our marketing team for formatting and everything. So I would expect in the next couple of weeks that we'll be putting out the updated model law, and we'll likely look to put together a webinar covering some of those updates. So not that you guys want to listen to me talk for another hour or two, but if you're interested, you're welcome to peruse that or even join that webinar when we do that, as well as just look at the new resource once it comes out. So thank you guys so much for your time this evening. Again, Carrie and Kate, thank you guys for being leaders in the space and for your time. My contact information is in the slides. Please feel free to reach out. We're always happy to help.
Thank you, Ian.
Thank you all. Have a wonderful night.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.